Thank you so much for having me here. It's been amazing to see the range of speakers and expertise at the table, and I hope I can talk to you a little bit about what we're doing at Facebook, but more broadly across the tech industry, and how to work with other sectors on some of these really difficult and gray area topics. So my background and expertise is on processes of radicalization and violent extremism. Again, this looks very different in different parts of the world. And if you'd asked me 5 years ago if I'd be working for a social media company, these jobs did not exist. We are now having to build out a whole new realm of positions around security, but that also includes human analysis and looking at real-world threat and seeing how that's reflected and the interplay between the online and offline. So we are trying to challenge not only terrorism, which is more the violent side of the spectrum, but what do we mean when we talk about extremism? That's a quite gray topic. And so I want to talk a little bit about the online landscape. How are we developing the policies in the online space around these difficult topics? But also, how are we defining what can be solved through algorithms and artificial intelligence versus where are we still in the gray and need to have more constructive, innovative approaches to pushing back that might not be about just censorship alone, which doesn't usually cure an idea. And then, what can we do with different sectors to work in the future? Because this is not just about one tech platform or even just the government or even just civil society. We really get better effects when we start strategically working together. So as a reminder, we are big. We have a lot of users on our platform. I think this number is even slightly outdated, but we have over 2 billion monthly users. And as part of this, we have over 181 million monthly users just in the Middle East. Over 85% of our users are outside of the US and Canada, so we cannot say that everything has to go back to Silicon Valley. I'm based in London because I cover Europe, Middle East, and Africa. I can't wait for California to wake up. But I also have an equal counterpart based in Singapore because she covers Asia Pacific and Southeast Asia, and she can't wait for London to wake up. So we are having to deal with localized issues in different time zones that takes a lot of context and nuance behind it. And our policies are having to govern everything that governments are having to think about. So not just things like terrorism, but hacked accounts, what is hate speech, when is it hate speech and when is it offensive humor, when does that cross a line? These are also very difficult topics and very culture specific. And so we're having to question in a lot of ways everything that governments are also having to create policies around, except we're trying to do it at a global scale because we don't want to make the experience in Singapore different to the experience on Facebook in France or in America. And when we talk about policies on violent extremism, we want to make sure that violent organizations do not have a presence on our platform. We also want to make sure that you're not allowed to glorify and praise or support violent organizations, and that you're not allowed to celebrate or promote graphic violence. So the celebration of harm of people goes against our policies. And it's one thing to say that, but we have to then enforce upon it, and that's when things get very difficult. And we have to use a combination of things. One way we know about what's going on in the world is from users flagging it to us. We know about things very quickly from our audiences flagging content to us. We know when an attack happens. We know when real-world harm is taking place. We know when there's a natural disaster very quickly, sometimes even quicker than the media. And then we need to operationalize it. So we have over 30,000 people globally just on our security and operations teams that have to be based in different time zones, that not only have to speak a language, but have to speak it very fluently. So I think my French is pretty good, but I shouldn't be the one reviewing French content in detail because slang and hate speech and cultural context is very nuanced. And so we need a really good understanding of what's being said, especially the difference between humor and sarcasm and offensive speech can be very tricky sometimes. And in some cases, when we're talking about real clear violating content, we can use algorithms and machine learning technology and artificial intelligence. So with the terrorism space, when we think about counterterrorism, we've actually learned a lot from other abuse areas, like child exploitation imagery. We've developed technology that's able to surface and identify known violating images. So for example, when we talk about a known identified piece of terrorist propaganda. We can hash that image. What that means is we create the equivalent of a digital fingerprint. And so any time that is shared or reshared, and a slight edit should still be able to pick it up, then we can immediately identify a match in that content. And the machine learning technology, in some cases, can make the decision to take it down automatically. So it's basically not even hit the platform. However, terrorism content is different than other types of content. We do see other sectors using it for different reasons. We see media sectors sharing it. We see academics sharing it. We also see activists that might share an image to condemn it. So anytime there's context shared within an image or video, it triages it away from just the machine decision-making to a human expertise team that has language expertise. So again, this is not just about finding the machine solve or just about making sure it's human. It's about the triage between machine expertise and human expertise. And humans are still much better at understanding nuance. Even humans are sometimes bad at nuance, but they're definitely better than machine learning. So this is a way that we can work together between machine learning and human expertise to make a solve. And things like this meant that in 2018, in the first 3 quarters, we took down 14.3 million pieces of identified terrorist content. Now, that's a lot, and that sounds scary, but actually, when you look at it, there was a big spike in the second quarter for terrorist content removed. And that's not because we saw this huge influx of content. It's actually because of things like training the machine to go back in time and find content that might have been there for 5 years but still shouldn't be there. And so we're going to see fluctuations, and sometimes numbers are elusive without the story behind them, and it's important to keep that conversation very open and transparent. So we need to post about things like this. We need to be able to talk about why and how those numbers matter. We also do things like fanning out. When we look at processes of radicalization, we do not see singular auto-radicalization online. If you study radicalization offline, you realize it's a very social phenomena. The concept of a lone wolf is a very rare, if ever, thing. And we see that things happen in networks. And online is the same as the offline in this respect. We see that there are very social structures around this. So if we see certain patterns happening within a group with very well-known and identified bad actor tendencies, we can fan out and surface that network, and again, triage that to human review so that we're getting the nuance and understanding of how that network is operating. But that doesn't really solve for when we say extremism or radicalization. This is a huge spectrum. And we're not talking about radical thought in general or extreme sports. We're talking about a process of radicalization that leads people to hate-based violence. That's what we're trying to tackle here. But that could mean a lot of things. We also look at the causalities behind this. What is causing people to join violent extremist groups? Whether that's a neo-Nazi white supremacy group that might be in Europe, or whether that is a Buddhist extremist group that might be targeting certain minorities in Southeast Asia, or whether that is Islamist extremism in another part of the world. These are very gray and long-tailed spectrums. And we need to understand the local context behind that. And we need to see how and where are we best placed with partnerships to challenge and push back against that. And that's usually not about taking down content. It's usually about looking at the difficult gray area and seeing how we can strategically and effectively push back on it. So a lot of that is about counter-speech. This is a disputed term. We call it counter-narratives, alternative narratives, counter-speech. We're talking about any type of content or movement that is going to strategically challenge hate speech and extremism. And the first question we have to ask is, where on the spectrum do we want to target? Are we talking about teaching young people to have a natural resilience to violent extremism so that when they do come across propaganda in the future, or when they are approached about violence, that they have a natural resiliency to push back? Or are we talking about somebody that's starting their journey into a group and just starting to question and sympathize with a group? Or are we talking about somebody that's already embedded in that group and we want to disengage them, somebody that might already have a swastika tattoo, somebody very much engaged in that group? And each approach is going to be extremely different, and the methodology to try to disengage someone from each of those levels is also going to be different. So what we can do is talk about best practices and partnerships. What we do know about counter-speech is when it works and when it doesn't work. We need to be very aware of how we're approaching and engaging these very difficult subject matters and very difficult audiences. So what is our form of speech? How are we talking to people? In the online space, for example, we know that if you have a photo or a video, your content goes 60 to 80 times further than just text-based alone. What is your tone of speech? Are you trying to be really serious with somebody? Are you trying to make them angry to create a cognitive opening? Are you trying to use humor to get them to look at your content a little longer and pose a question? And that is up to the person creating the content to decide on that. And then who's the most effective speaker? Who's going to have credibility with that audience? Is it a peer-to-peer network? Are you using a celebrity to convey that message? Is it coming from a government figure? And all of those affect the tone and the form. When is it effective? We know it has to be timely. When you're trying to tell somebody to push back on hate, why does it matter to them today versus yesterday? So some great examples are things like the Bring Back Our Girls campaign. And who's heard of the Bring Back Our Girls campaign? And there's really no reason 10 years ago that you would have or should have heard about that campaign, because it dealt with a group of girls in a country most of you have probably never been to, in a city that you've probably never heard of, with a group that probably doesn't affect you in your day-to-day life. But the campaign itself, the language alone, opened it up to a global community. It was Bring Back Our Girls. It was something that everyone could catch on to, and it was able to trend itself because it was in English, so that it reached a wider audience, and it used language that we could all conform to. We also look at targeted and authentic content. So Average Muhammad is probably a campaign you've never heard of because you're not the target audience. It was a localized campaign made by an activist in America that lives between America and the UK, and he wanted to reach Somali young people that are second or third generation immigrants to talk about difficult subject matters as you're growing up in a culture that might not be your own, and create prevention and resiliency. So you wouldn't be the target audience. And some people have used humor to just pose a question and make you question, what are you talking about, and why is this difficult? So the bottom example is a German case study called Kein Grund, Rassist zu werden. I do not speak German, but it roughly translates to no reason to be racist. And it was talking about micro grievances in Germany against refugees and immigrants, and saying, you know, bad hair day, no reason to be racist. Oops, I dropped my ice cream, no reason to be racist. And as silly as that sounds, what it then linked to was content and commentary about how different immigrants are doing amazing things within German society, or real data and statistics about why this crisis was actually not about what was affecting job opportunities in Germany. So what can we as tech companies do? Well, it's upon us to create an infrastructure to upscale and upskill this type of strategic pushback and dialogue, to make sure it not only has the time and place to be optimized on our platforms, but that activists also get training, things like online social media training, whether that's developing hackathons in different parts of the world, whether that's helping with methodology. So how do you actually know that your content is hitting the right audiences? How can you use things like ad credits to strategically reach the right audiences in the first place? But also getting feedback from academic communities and really testing what works and what doesn't work, and asking universities and researchers to work with activists, because usually the natural NGOs that are trying to voice and push back on hate do not naturally have connections with the academics that can do the real deep dives on methodology and effectiveness. And so even for us, this is not about one tech platform doing it alone. We have to rely heavily on a range of partnerships. If we're going to engage somewhere in Africa, it has to be with local entities on the ground. If we're going to do this in Europe or anywhere else, we need to have partnerships that are strong and connected and localized and authentic. Because even Facebook telling you not to be an extremist is not the authentic voice that's going to really help in the long run. So who has that network, and where can we tap into it and help them help themselves and help them continue their work more effectively? And also in that counterterrorism space, going back to that harder end of the spectrum, there's a lot of lessons learned by the larger tech companies. And we do find that the more we push down on that clearer space, it doesn't mean those bad actors just disappear. We are not government, we're not arresting people, we're not putting people out of the real world, they're just proliferating. So what we've seen is, and the academic research shows, the more we push, we see the proliferation and the diversification of online platforms being used for bad actor content or for dissemination of messaging and conversations. So the global Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism was formed about a year and a half ago by Facebook, Microsoft, YouTube, and Twitter. And we developed 3 distinct pillars to try to help other sectors. So one is about where can we share technology? So where can we actually share things like that photo and video matching? So photo and video matching technology that I talked about, we share with about 13 different companies now, so not just large ones, but also smaller ones that were identified as having problems with terrorist content shares. And we have a by industry, for industry shared database of over 100,000 unique pieces of content. Now it's up to those platforms how they operationalize that, how they use it. All of our platforms work a little bit differently, but we also give training for them around the content if they have questions, and our engineers will work with their engineers to make sure that they understand what's coming back at them. We also want to make sure we have a better idea and communication with the research world. So we created a global research network that has about 8 institutes on 7 different countries and 4 continents to give us strategic feedback about what violent extremism and terrorism looks like in their regions. So that when we're talking about a different group that appears on the scene, we actually have the context behind where they came from. Are they new? Are they attached to an older group? How are they using the online and offline space? And then where can we share basic knowledge? So a lot of the conversations with smaller tech platforms are not about the big complicated solves. A lot of this is helping them identify, how do people flag to you have bad content on your platform? Does it explicitly say in your terms of service that this is not allowed? Are you able to respond to a government request for data? So we worked with one organization in Poland, and they were really confused as soon as foreign language government requests for data started coming to them, and they didn't speak these other languages and had no idea how to even respond in the first place. So we work a lot with Tech Against Terrorism, which is an NGO that came out of a UN counterterrorism executive directorate mandate, to help us liaise with other companies around the world on some of the basics to create a baseline of preventative measures. So going forward, this is also a role for government to take place in. It is up to our bigger companies as well as government infrastructure to create the environment and understanding to not only identify and take down the worst of the worst bad content, but also to help the voice of really authentic and really hardworking activists and NGOs that can push back on strategic hate speech and extremism and provide a space for them to grow and provide feedback so that they can flourish. Because sometimes it's basic advice, sometimes it's just having a little more funding or translation or knowing how to get your voice off of the offline space and effectively into the online space. So there's still more work to be done, but we do have proof of concept. This is a really growing sphere. And again, we need to localize all of these efforts as much as possible as we expand them. So I will leave it there, but I am around for the rest of the day, and I look forward to all of your questions. Thank you.